From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Democratic nominee Kamala Harris finally gives a framework of an economic agenda. Is it any different in form than what we have seen from Bidenomics? And how does it compare to what Donald Trump is offering? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I am Kim Strassel. I am joined today by my fantastic colleagues, Alicia Finley and Bill McGurn. Under fire for not talking policy, Kamala Harris this week started rolling out a few discrete proposals. Last weekend, and we talked about this a little bit, she mirrored Trump and she called for eliminating the federal tax on tips. That's not a huge proposal. Now we're getting some of her bigger rollout. Let's hear her address in North Carolina today, what she's calling her agenda.
As president, I will be laser focused on creating opportunities for the middle class that advance their economic security, stability, and dignity. Together, we will build what I call an opportunity economy. An opportunity economy.
Well, we're getting some specifics of that opportunity economy as well. Some of the details here: a call for 3 million new housing units in her first 4 years in office, a huge expansion of the child tax credit, including a very big boost for families with newborns. And here's the one that really got my attention. Quote, the first ever federal ban on price gouging on food and groceries, setting clear rules of the road to make clear that big corporations can't unfairly exploit consumers to run up excessive corporate profits on foods and groceries. So, in other words, price controls, something Nixon and Carter tried with disastrous results. Bill, we're going to delve into each of these, but if we're looking for a broad theme here, this is what I see. I see Joe Biden's approval ratings are in the tank, and that's because the top issue for Americans right now is inflation and insane housing costs, and we've seen this under the Biden-Harris administration. This was obviously caused, every economist understands it, by Biden's insane amounts of spending, which included $5.8 trillion in deficits in his first 3 years alone. So this is Kamala Harris, in my mind, trying to neutralize this liability with promises of what really boil down to more government misallocation of capital, doubling down on it, as it were, kind of saying, hi, I know we made prices really bad, so here I now promise to attempt to artificially control those prices and give you free stuff. So, Bill, is that going to sell in your mind?
It may. She's not pressed on it, and so far she hasn't been. I was struck, too. I mean, she was talking about how much worse off American consumers were because of food prices, housing prices, as though she and Joe Biden haven't been in charge the past 4 years. It's really incredible. It's very clear, despite Joe Biden saying, I think yesterday, that Kamala Harris and he were kind of joined at the hip on economic policy. There's no dissent. You'll never hear Harris say Bidenomics. That, I think, is clear. So she has a real pro-government agenda, and it's just staggering in its naivete. And, you know, it blames the private sector for everything, for prices going up. And not once does she even consider that it was the Biden administration spending that drove up prices for these people. After all, inflation was, 1.4%, I think, when they took over. And now we're celebrating that it's under 2.9, still twice what it was when they came in. And there's no sense that the government doesn't know better and should be a little more modest about these things. I could say more about the housing. If we're going to depend on the federal government to get 3 million new houses built in 4 years, I mean, I think that's an extraordinary claim.
Yeah, let's talk about that housing proposal, Alicia. We know why she's going there. Along with grocery and fuel prices, rent and mortgage rates have become a huge concern for voters. And this is always a bit of a thorny place for presidents because they don't have a lot of control, at least in the short term. Housing supplies usually comes down to state and local area rules, and housing costs are pegged to interest rates. I mean, in the long term, presidents can certainly help or harm those interest rates. That's why we are where we are now now, given Biden's spending. But the Harris proposal seems to hinge on providing a new tax incentive for companies that build homes for first-time buyers, also free money, $25,000 down payment assistance for first-generation, I like this is new too, first-generation homeowners, and $10,000 for first-time buyers. Can you tell us more about what's in here?
So you mentioned the $25,000 in down payment assistance. What I find really ironic about this program or plan that she's putting out is one of the reasons that home prices are so high and haven't even surpassed the inflation rate over the past few years. Actually, they've increased by about 50%, the median home since before the pandemic. In some places in the country, like this Florida, and actually in some places in the Midwest, they've increased even more. And it's not just because the overall inflationary environment plus the low interest rates really drove up demand. One thing that the Biden administration did, and it has gotten very little notice, is it eased lending standards and allowed people to qualify with very low down payments, not just 3% in some cases, which has always been the case for the FHA, but for the other Fannie and Freddie mortgages, they allowed people to qualify for 3%. And not only that, if you want to use a gift or something like that, people donate to your wedding, anything, even lenders can provide that 3%. You don't actually have to put that down. That really has fueled demand. And that is one of the culprits for the high housing prices. Now, what she actually kind of wants to do now is to double down on all these subsidies for home buyers, which is merely going to drive the prices up even more. You mentioned the first-time home buyers, basically a down payment assistance, or you can call it a tax credit for $25,000 here. One of the kickers I think is funny is that you don't even have to be a first-time home buyer, or at least not according to some of the legislation that Democrats have introduced on this. You just have to not own a home in the last 3 years.
Wow.
So presumably Tim Walz could qualify because he sold his home in 2019 to move into the governor's mansion. And actually the first-generation tax credit for homeowners, you actually don't have to be a first-generation a homeowner either. Your parents just can't currently own a home. So if your parents are like in assisted living or renting, you could qualify for that too. This is just going to be a feeding frenzy. And as we, discussing earlier, that's just going to fuel inflation in housing. On the supply side, she's proposed these kind of bonanza of new programs to support affordable housing. But the problem is that these kinds of programs always come with strings attached, prevailing wage mandates and such that drive up the cost of building construction. And you can see this very clearly in her home state of California, where it costs $1 million just to build a single affordable housing unit. And so what you're going to really see is more bureaucracy and probably less housing construction as the Harris administration tries to essentially federalize housing policy.
Yeah, and this gets to Bill's point. Will anybody actually explain this to voters, that a lot of this is going to turn out to create the opposite of what she is promoting? Bill, speaking of free money, another big part of her agenda that she laid out was an expansion of the child tax credit. This has been a long-time Democratic wish. Right now, the tax credit's $2,000 per child, but it was expanded for a time under COVID to $3,600. Democrats have been pushing to get that back up there. Now Harris wants to permanently return it to $3,600, but also, and this is a biggie, provide $6,000 to families during the first year of a child's life. So basically a newborn tax bonus. This is kind of a worrisome proposal to me, not just because of its enormous costs. It's very expensive. But the reason that I worry about this policy is because it's got some Republican support behind it. Guys like J.D. Vance are also a fan of a huge new spending blowout for a child tax credit. I mean, my issue with it is it provides no economic benefit. It's hugely costly. But do you think by running on this as part of her agenda, it is going to increase the general pressure for that number to go up?
I think so. It's more about politics and being seen as being pro-family. I agree with you. Look, I lived in Hong Kong, which had a flat 15% tax rate. Actually, it had a progressive tax, but the cap was 15%. So for most people, it was just 15%. And that was the most pro-family measure that was out there. It saves so much time. I could do my taxes in really 10 minutes for so forth. And the problem is, I think it's very bad when we start using the tax code to engineer social policy. And the child tax credit is not where it stops. There's all sorts of tax credits credits now, and we're gunking up the code again. So I would think that even families would benefit from a similar tax system and not one credit in exchange for all sorts of other bad things in the tax code.
Totally agree with you. Some of the benefits of that Trump tax code reform back in 2017 was simply that it got rid of a lot of that junk and made the tax code a lot more simple. We're going to take a break. When we come back, price controls. How is that going to work, and how would it work out when we come back? Welcome back. I am Kim Strassel here with my colleagues Bill McGurn and Alicia Finley. We're talking about some of these Harris economic plans that she's rolling out. Talking about all of this, and one of the things that she's supposedly going to provide some more details on here, and one that gives me deja vu all over, is euphemistically being called by some in the press as a federal ban on corporate price gouging. And just to break through that legacy media doublespeak, that's another word for price controls. And we don't know the exact mechanics, but some of the details suggest that she is maybe going to model this on a 2020 bill, Alicia, by Elizabeth Warren, a plan, by the way, that we completely ridiculed, which would have allowed the Federal Trade Commission to ban any quote, grossly excessive prices during an atypical disruption of the market. Let's listen to Donald Trump respond to her idea of price controls.
Now Kamala is reportedly proposing communist price controls. She wants price controls. And if they worked, I'd go along with it too, but they don't work. They actually have the exact opposite impact and effect. But it leads to food shortages, rationing, hunger, dramatically more inflation. Their Inflation Reduction Act, by the way, was a disaster. It's what caused the inflation. Their Inflation Reduction Act was a con job.
Alicia, one thing just to start with, the notion that corporations are currently gouging is simply nonsense. If you look, producer prices have risen at almost precisely the same rate as consumer prices. This is being caused by government, all of these higher prices. But I don't think people really understand what she means by this and the complexity of this. I mean, how in your mind do you see such a proposal working, and how bad would it be?
Well, you're right about both. It would be inordinately complex. You've referred back to this Elizabeth Warren legislation, which was also backed by Bernie Sanders, and actually some of the Midwest senators, Bob Casey and Tammy Baldwin, who are both up for re-election, have jumped on board too with this idea that we should give the FTC power to go after, not prosecute per se, but sue companies and punish them if they charge excessive prices. And really the FTC would be empowered to decide what is excessive. And this really wouldn't only occur during market shocks, as Elizabeth Warren says. I mean, that could be defined as, the current Ukraine war. There really would be no limiting principle. The FTC would decide what is an excessive price. So is $4 too much to pay for a gallon of milk, $3 too much for a dozen of eggs? Well, the FTC would decide that and would be able to punish, fine companies. Under the legislation, it would be about 5% of their annual revenues. All of this would create enormous uncertainty for businesses and would limit their ability to, again, pass on some of their cost increases, which would cause more shortages. Recall, of course, prices is how businesses balance supply and demand. And also, when you increase prices and allow them to increase prices to provide some kind of a profit margin, which is important, that encourages more supply. So if you recall, early in the pandemic, there were all kinds of food shortages, and that was because, producers just weren't able to increase supply enough to meet demand. And that's essentially what you would have here. How it would work out, you mentioned the 1970s, the Nixon-Carter price controls. Yes, likely to see gas lines again, empty supermarket shelves, all of that. I mean, you could look further south to Venezuela, which has tried the same thing. Anywhere it's been tried, the Soviet Union, as Donald Trump raised, it's been just a disaster and has immiserated people. people and has actually, again, done the opposite of what her quote-unquote economic opportunity agenda purports to achieve.
Yeah, Bill, I'm almost old enough, you may be old enough, to remember this in real time, what happened. I mean, back in 1971, Richard Nixon announced an executive order. I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States. And it was meant to be a 90-day freeze that was going to be enforced by a pay board and a price commission. It was an absolute disaster. Prices skyrocketed. You had hoarding. You had shortages in different areas. I mean, I don't think people really understand. We are talking about thousands upon thousands of products here that some federal bureaucrat would end up telling your local Safeway what they could charge for. Your milk, your Cheetos, your bread, your dishwasher soap. Do you think the country is now old enough that people have forgotten what this might mean?
Well, many people were born after don't remember it. I do remember it and how miserable it was for people at the time. And that's what I find so astounding about Kamala Harris's speech. There's no acknowledgement that government might have something to do with it. The other thing I was looking at the same time, I happened to come across on Facebook a Johnny Carson interview with Reagan in 75 when he's going to challenge Ford for the presidency. And Carson said, we got all these problems, laid out the problems just as you did. What do you do? And Reagan basically said, well, I think government is a problem. If you had government get out of the way, you might do better. And in the Kamala Biden universe, there's never a kind word for the private sector. I mean, we live in an era of abundance in the most affluent country in the world. And there's no sense of the amazing nature of the private sector to produce all these things. Rather, they have a view that the government knows better. They would know what price to charge for a car or for a bell pepper. It's astounding in its arrogance. And I think that also betrays the ignorance of how pricing works. And just to assume that if prices go up, there's some evil grocer down the street who's jacking up the price of tomatoes just to hurt you. It's fantasy.
Yeah, ask the Soviets how that worked out for them, by the way.